Friedrich Nietzsche was one of the most influential philosophers, certainly of the last couple hundred years and of all time more generally. He was a German philosopher who's primarily a 19th century figure. He lived a kind of a tragic life, but a life that very much influenced the way he thought about the world. He was born in 1844, the son of a Lutheran pastor. He had poor health his entire life. He was not originally a philosopher. In fact, he was, in his university days, a student of philology, which is just the study of the origin of languages and the development of classical and ancient languages in particular. He was influenced by the thinking of Arthur Schopenhauer and also influenced by the musical ideas of Richard Wagner. He was an exceptional student and was offered before the end of his doctoral studies a chair in philology, but because of certain works that he wrote and his inability to get along with some of his colleagues, he ultimately was compelled to leave the university and to strike out on his own, living on pension money and small stipends until eventually his money ran very low as he continued to write without substantive financial support. Nietzsche, unfortunately, when he was a young man, contracted syphilis from a visit to a brothel, and it cut his life short. He had a mental breakdown in 1889. Famously, he was, as the story goes, riding at his desk and looked out the window and saw a cabbie in the street beating his horse, and Nietzsche ran out and threw his arms around the horse and was led away to an asylum, singing at the top of his lungs. But before he had that breakdown, he wrote a very profound set of works. He's very much an iconoclastic figure. Certainly not a figure with which I, as a Christian philosopher, agree at all, but he is a figure who I think it is important to give a charitable read to, and to try to really get into his mind and understand why he said the things that he said. Nietzsche famously characterized what he was doing as doing philosophy with a hammer, and by this he meant sounding out the idols of Western culture. He is a figure who attempted to call into question much, if not all, of the foundations upon which Western culture was built. And among those idols that Nietzsche wanted to sound out, as he saw them at least, were things like belief in a transcendent reality, including especially God, belief in religion in general, and belief in traditional values and moral teachings. Nietzsche also advocated perspectivalism, which was an attack upon the very idea of truth, which is something that has been central to the development of Western culture for a long time. Nietzsche's own views that he advocated in place of these other ideas might be characterized as a revaluation of values. At least that was his own view of it. He wished to replace the idols of Western civilization with values of his own. Of course, one of the founding figures of Western civilization, a figure who is encountered prominently at the beginning of this philosophy segment, is Socrates. And Nietzsche claims that Socrates is fraudulent, and in Nietzsche's words, Socrates is decadent. For Nietzsche, decadence just means a denial of the will to life and the associated will to power. And so Socrates has a decadent view of life. He's a life denier. He takes a negative attitude toward bodily existence. If you remember, Socrates thinks that life is a sort of an entrapment of the soul. So the slave boy example in the Meno is a case where the slave boy's soul, so Socrates thinks, again, Plato is giving him a fictionalized rendering, slave boy's soul is at one time in the realm of the forms, and his soul is in communion with the forms and has full knowledge. Then he becomes embodied, and he loses that knowledge. And this is an example of the body trapping the soul. The soul had been free and in a superior state of being, and then the body traps the soul. And then in the Phaedo, if you remember that dialogue as well, Socrates seems to be grateful to be healed from the sickness of the body, and the sickness is especially articulated in his statement that he owes a rooster to the god of healing. And for Nietzsche, this is evidence that Socrates thinks that death was a cure for life, and that he had an anti-bodily view of life, or an anti-physical existence. And Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and most of Western philosophy then consist of this manifestation of decadence. And for Nietzsche, this decadence is emblematic just of a general sickness in Western culture. Nietzsche even characterizes Socrates' physical ugliness as symptomatic of his decadent personality. So for Nietzsche, also symptomatic of Socrates' decadence is his use of reason. So Socrates, he says, has an overdeveloped sense of logic and is nasty in his employment of dialectic to make people look foolish. These are all ad hominem arguments. More on that in just a moment. But for Nietzsche, Socrates is a figure who's rather decadent in his employment of reason. If you recall what Socrates did, he would go around Athens and he would pose difficult questions, especially challenging the intelligentsia of the day, the business classes, the political classes, the powerful, and asking them if they could define their terms and ideas much more clearly. And in ways that he would ask these questions in ways that would make them uncomfortable. Ultimately, they couldn't handle it, and they condemned him to death. But Socrates followed the following formula. If we just use reason and explore the subject matter, then we can arrive at truth. And that was what Socrates employed to look at things like the Euthyphro dilemma. He would employ that formula, the use of reason, to arrive at truth in order to discern the immortality of the soul in the Phaedo, and the definition of knowledge in the Meno, the understanding of what virtue is in the Meno, as well as other investigations such as our allegiance to the state and so forth in the Crito. For Socrates, then, ostensibly, if we just use reason, then we can arrive at truth about ourselves and about the world around us, and thus achieve a superior state of being. But for Nietzsche, what really happened was that Socrates was not an honest seeker of truth. He really wanted to exert his will to power, and he wanted to get inside of other people's minds. He wanted not just to control their external bodies like a tyrant might say, but Socrates wanted to control their minds. He knew that control of their minds was actually superior as a form of control. And so this is what Socrates was really trying to do in the dialogues. And in fact, Socrates was very successful, Nietzsche thinks. Over the centuries, the Socratic belief that if we just use reason, we can arrive at truth, has convinced the whole tradition. All thinkers since Socrates have basically subscribed to these views. But for Nietzsche, this is an example of decadence. It's an example of Socratic deception to try to gain control over others. For Nietzsche, instead of using reason, we should turn to instinct. Happiness and instinct are one for Nietzsche. And Socrates' suicide is simply symptomatic of decadence. Nietzsche is famous for launching ad hominem critiques of Socrates, and these actually are part and parcel of his criticisms of the Socratic use of reason. If Nietzsche were to try to attack Socrates by saying Socrates was wrong, he would actually be still operating within Socrates' worldview. He would still be saying that there's such a thing as right and wrong, and Nietzsche would be operating within the parameters that Socrates had set. And this is something that Nietzsche wants to avoid. So Nietzsche instead attacks Socrates' person using ad hominems, saying Socrates was ugly, or Socrates was nasty, or Socrates hallucinated, etc., and so forth. And Nietzsche, in developing this critique, is actually quite consciously and intentionally trying to step outside of the Socratic worldview so that he doesn't assume the categories of truth. If one cannot criticize someone else for being wrong, then one must come up with some other way of criticizing that someone else. And for Nietzsche, this other way is to use ad hominem arguments against Socrates. Nietzsche also famously is opposed to Christianity and iconoclastic in his opposition to Christianity. He thinks that Christian morality especially is decidedly anti-natural. So he thinks that the Christian teaching to control our passions or to exercise dominance over the instincts which would dominate us is in fact symptomatic of decadence. So for Nietzsche, the Christian teaching, the famous Great Reversal, Christian moral teaching of Christ, of Jesus of Nazareth in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus of Nazareth upholds the value of things like meekness and humility and things like obedience and service. Nietzsche thinks that this is in fact symptomatic of feebleness and weakness, and he thinks that the Christian teaching that we should seek to control our instincts or desires is also symptomatic of decadence. For Nietzsche, we instead need to turn towards a life-affirming morality, where we embrace sensuality, where we seek to embrace our lust for power, our desire for power, our instinct for life, and where we reject all forms of what he calls it, as he calls it, hyper-rational, philosophical, or religious approaches to morality, where morality is perceived to be a matter of mastering instincts. For Nietzsche, instead, we need to embrace instinct. We need to seize our desires to dominate and to embrace our desires to indulge or to embrace to participate in the sensual. And this involves rejecting the idea of God and rejecting a morality that is anti-natural. For Nietzsche, the idea of morality, as at least traditional morality as being anti-natural, is something that has gone on to be very influential. So this is along with Nietzsche's perspectivalism, one of his most enduring and influential contributions to Western thought. Nietzsche believes that there is no particular point of view that is true. They're just different perspectives. And Nietzsche also thinks that we need to embrace instinctual morality as the basis for our way of living. And both of these have been incredibly influential ideas in the 20th century. Needless to say, as a Christian philosopher, Nietzsche's ideas about life, about human beings, and about the world are about as opposed to my own as it's possible to be. However, I am grateful to Nietzsche for what I see as showing us the natural outcome of his views. So I personally think that it's a pretty poetically fitting, although I think it's very sad, that Nietzsche is driven insane by his syphilis and by the results of his own hedonistic living, by his embrace of the instinctual as he saw it. This is again very sad, but it seems in a certain sense to be fitting, because a life of that kind does have certain consequences. And Nietzsche, in living out a life of that kind, of course faced those consequences. At any rate, though, I'm also very grateful to Nietzsche for articulating the ideas that he did. Certainly he's a very original thinker. And in that sense, he deserves a charitable read, even by those of us who disagree with him at a very fundamental level. And also, he is deserving of a charitable read just by virtue of his sheer influence. One cannot really understand the modern world and the trains of thought that are present in the modern world without encountering Nietzsche and his interpretation of the world.